So today, my first question is that what are the opportunities and challenges China and the US may face before the 2020 US presidential election?
Yeah. So first of all, I think that we are at a difficult time for U.S.-China relations, and I think they've much deteriorated in the past few years, and probably we're at one of the worst points in recent history of this relationship. And the pandemic, I think, could have been a great opportunity for collaboration. And I think the world was looking at US-China leadership and cooperation in trying to solve this crisis. But instead, China and the US opted for having a more antagonistic relationship. Maybe this was not for China, was not China intention, but then we see also in China rhetoric, increasing hostile rhetoric toward the US, Pompeo, Trump, etc. And we see also very different approaches toward multilateralism and global governance. We see China and Xi Jinping that pledged $2 billion to the World Health Organizations, while US decided to terminate its relationship with the organization and cutting off its money. So even like multilaterally, we see this kind of a pandemic that could have been an opportunity to collaborate becoming actually a politicized event. The COVID-19 became the China virus in Trump and Pompeo world. They keep calling it Chinese virus. They try to, politicize and use it for, I think, for the election of Trump and blaming China. And I think these tensions have to do really with the escalation of economic rivalry that culminated with the full-fledged trade war. And now the economies are decoupling. So I don't see many opportunities right now. I mean, it's a very tense situation. I think there's been an escalation, and sadly, I do not see much before the elections. And actually, I see further politicization from the side of Trump, of China. Yeah.
Whether the U.S. technical blockade against China, particularly, Huawei 5G, and Huawei CFO Ms. Meng Wanzhou's potential extradition to the U.S. trigger tensions between the two countries. What do you think?
Yeah. So I think that there are already a lot of tensions for the U.S. technical blockade against China, and for the Ms. Meng potential extradition to the U.S. There's also tension with Canada, and of course, China is very upset and is trying to defend, its own position, especially Huawei. And now they're trying to lobby very hard the U.S. government. In 2019, they spent so much more Huawei in lobbying the U.S. government, trying to persuade the government to change a bit its stand on Huawei. And the U.S., of course, is very scared of Huawei. It feels threatened because China is taking the lead. I mean, Huawei is now the leading company for development of 5G. And the fear is that there are ties with the Chinese government and possible also a dual use of technology, so that this technology can also have a military use in the future. And although a lot of these fear have not yet been proven, like for instance, that there is a back door that allows Huawei to access sensible information, but this has not yet been proven. So despite this tension, last Monday, the U.S. Commerce Department announced that it will allow American companies to collaborate with Huawei on setting standards for 5G networks. Although the U.S. government said that the U.S. will continue to crack down on the Chinese company. And the reason for this is that Huawei is the leader in 5G technology, and the US is afraid of being sidelined if it cannot cooperate with Huawei. And at the same time, I think it will be very scary, a world that has a split in the market between Huawei and who knows which company, maybe Ericsson, but the US is still very far with, I think, 5G technology. And so this, I think, is positive that there was this openness and for American companies to collaborate with Huawei. But again, I think the fundamental tone is still the same, and there is this sense of threat from the US of Huawei and the Chinese innovation and technology. Yeah.
So according to the first stage of the China-U.S. trade agreement, China should purchase U.S. goods and services by $76.7 billion this year. Due to the impact of the outbreak and global trade decline, will China successfully complete its procurement obligations, or if not, will the U.S. present understandings or a rebuke?
Yeah, so I think there's been probably, I mean, of course, a slowdown with COVID because COVID-19 has affected dramatically the economic performance of China. And if we look at numbers, we can look at the Peterson Institute for International Economics that has developed a US-China phase one tracker that looks at China monthly purchases of US goods covered by phase one deal. And so if we look at that, we have the number until April 2020, and China's year-to-date total imports of these products from the United States was 26 billion, which is a bit less if compared to the prorated year-to-date target, which would have been 57 billion. And the same is valid for the US export to China, which is less, is almost half than the target for the time. Last Wednesday, the US trade representative said that the phase one of the deal is still on track, and the US trade deal doesn't seem to be weakening, despite the clashes of the two nations, the pandemics, and China also falling behind the targets. So I think that there's been, of course, a change, but so far, I mean, if the US trade representative said that is China still on track and the deal is still fine, I think we are good. And I'm afraid, again, that the success or not of the deal will be also partly politicized in the future election, because maybe it's useful for Trump to show strength that the deal is successful somehow. And so this we'll see probably in the future, but hopefully the US will take into account the fact that there is, a pandemic and the economy has slowed down also in China. So
impacted by coronavirus pandemic, coupled with unilateral and anti-globalization sentiments, global outbound investment activities have been severely challenged. Will this affect the further implementation of BRI?
Yes, I think so, and there are already many projects that have been stopped or suspended for the pandemic. I know, for instance, in Italy, in Trieste port, but also if you look at Africa, Africa now is suffering a lot, like developing countries that has a huge debt owed to China. And so they're now trying to ask for a memorandum or even to forgive the debt to China. At the same time, I think recently there were some projects that Kenya took more loan from China. I think that the Belt and Road will be affected also because global supply chain will be affected. But overall, I think it's still kind of, it's been implemented, and many of the projects have repristinated now slowly. And also some have talked about the Belt and Road, medical Belt and Road initiative, because the same kind of connections were used to dispatch masks or medical supplies. So I think, the BRI was also transformed into something else, like, now given the pandemic.
With the China-U.S. relations continue deteriorating, what will be the situation for Chinese students or scholars studying in the US?
So I think that I'm also not that optimistic for that. I mean, we'll see again the election, who will be elected next. It's true that, like, if you look at numbers, I mean, also there was this recent US strategy toward PRC that discussed actually students, because I think there is an awareness that Chinese students represent the majority of students in American universities, so that they also bring a lot of money. So US universities very often are dependent on the students' fees. And so this report said that the most visa have been granted, like, so there's been less and less rejection of Chinese students for visa. But at the same time, I think there is also alarmism for, espionage and influence efforts of China through the students. And so I think this is something that the US wants to tackle. And I mean, I would be concerned if I were a Chinese parent to send my kid in this country. You see all these images now with the protests on the street in terms of violence, and also in terms of opportunities afterwards, because you spend a lot of money to send your kids here, and then, for visa reason, you cannot even stay in the US. So it's quite challenging. And also there is an economic situation right now with COVID that I think creates less opportunities for US citizens, not to mention Chinese citizens coming here. So we'll see. I hope reasonability and reason will win. And so, because I think Chinese students are a huge resource, not just in terms of money, but also in terms of intellect and talents. And so they contribute greatly to research and innovation here in the States. So hopefully they will continue to be welcome. But yeah.
How will the China-U.S. relations affect the Americans working or studying in China and the Chinese, working in the U.S.?
Yeah. So I think, again, also here, I'm not that optimistic. And I think it has to do also with the global economy, with globalization, where globalization will go after this pandemic. Whether there will be a retreat from globalization, and so an increase of borders, barriers, visa, and so that probably will reduce also all these exchanges that we had so far. And I think we might witness to an insourcing. So relying on workers of our country, of the US. The US will rely on US workers rather than Chinese workers coming from abroad. And I think now, for instance, they're talking about restriction of H-1 visa in the States for workers coming to the States, talented workers. And so that will be kind of bad. But also China has increased some of the restrictions, and there was this case of journalists that were sent off from China, American journalists, media. And so I think from both sides there are tensions, which again, I think it's hard to predict too much, and this pandemic is something quite new, and how it will transform the world, we don't necessarily know. Yeah.
So what are the other challenges or opportunities you see in the post-COVID-19 era, or anything related you would like to add?
Yeah. So again, I don't have a crystal ball, and I think it's very hard to read the present, the dynamics of the present, and to imagine the future is even harder. But I think that we have two factors in particular to look at, like for US-China relations. One is how the pandemic will be handled, and the economic recovery, how countries will recover from this. And the second is the US elections. And so with regard to the US, to the economy, I think that many scholars have discussed this pandemic as a watershed in history, and that will create a different world order. I think that is actually just accelerating trends that already existed, and for instance, U.S.-China competition and the fact that China is rising power. And from the perspective of economic globalization, I think that the epidemic has increasingly challenged the way we think of globalization, and I think a lot of countries started to think about the industrial chains, external dependence, and as I said before, I think they start to move to insourcing, probably to create a shorter and more diverse supply chain process. And so this will, of course, affect China, U.S., the post-pandemic world. But then, of course, there is also the U.S. election in November. And I think that we have a bipartisan kind of agreement about China here in the States. And so I think both Democrats and Republicans, they changed the tone toward China. So they quite agree that China represents a threat and is a competitor, and that has to be addressed. But I think so that both, if Biden gets elected, I think he will be tough, but more pragmatic and probably reasonable and predictable in his policies toward China. And also, I think he will re-engage the allies. So the transatlantic relations, I think he will foster probably the international image of the U.S. If Trump gets elected, I think he will continue to be tough on China, but in a much more unpredictable way, a much more erratic way. And I think from the Chinese side, they see there's more and more articles. I think because also on the Chinese side, there is the division about Trump re-election. And for some, I was reading that is something probably even positive, because Trump is seen as eroding U.S. Image, international image. And so basically, it will also detach himself more from the allies, leaving more space to China to expand its influence and create new partnerships with, allies of the U.S. And I think the big questions in the post-COVID world is whether we will be able to maintain a track to continue to preserve peace and development in the world in the future, or we will enter a more realistic world where there is strategic competition and there is the possibility to have major conflicts between powers, US and China. And I think this depends greatly on the way US and China are engaging in their relationship, and this, I think, will produce very different results. And I also think that the biggest question is also whether US and China will continue to resolve their differences within the existing multilateral order, existing rules, or whether they will create two separate worlds, like giving rise to a new Cold War. I hope for the former. I hope they will re-engage there will be a new wave of multilateralism, but we don't know. And we hear more and more this Cold War kind of logic taking over, but I think only time will tell.